Hey everybody, this is Jason Wilson again with the Curious About Cannabis podcast. Thanks for tuning in again. This is going to be a shorter interview than normal, but it's going to be the beginning of a series of interviews. This is another field recording, so you're going to hear some background nature sounds that I hope you enjoy. Today I am out and about on the trails with my friend and herbal scientist, Travis Simpson. Travis, thanks so much for sitting down with me and being willing to chat about herbal science.
It is certainly a pleasure to be here with you.
Awesome. So let's just jump right into it. So lately you've been doing some work in the hemp space in Oregon. I know traditionally you've done all sorts of herbal science work, processing herbs, making different sorts of products, topicals, ingestibles out of medicinal plants, and now you're working with hemp and learning your way around cannabis over the past several years. What are some of the unique challenges and opportunities that you've noticed in working with hemp compared to other herbs that you've worked with before?
It's a really good question. Some of the challenges that we encounter are not as straightforward as we typically would experience with other botanical processing spaces. One of the unique things about the hemp space is, independent of the plant itself, the people who tend to orbit around this community. And that eccentricity and potential ties to previous regimes of cannabis regulation create a unique sphere where there are a lot of resources and a lot of curiosity and a huge diversity of technical skill sets. So we're here navigating the wonderful complexities of the cannabis plant in one part on its unique chemical diversity, but on another part, what is perceived in a market. And within herbal products, the general philosophy is to capture the most valued profile from that plant, being that no one solvent can capture everything. And within the hemp space, we're being very reductionistic in the topic of active constituents. And most herbal products have specifications for their purity, their potency, their identity, and then as well as their final composition within a supplement. But the cannabis space is very, very focused on just the potency and purity, which is kind of a new area for us to navigate, but it provides resources to analytical technology that might not be readily available to other dietary supplement manufacturing environments.
Oh, okay. So that makes sense. So when producing cannabis products, you're so concerned about CBD content, THC content, all these sort of things that in-house you have to, or with a relationship with a good third-party lab, you've got to be able to do a lot more analytical work than you necessarily would do normally, and more sophisticated analytical work. Because I know with traditional herbal products, identity testing and potency testing, you might do thin layer chromatography and get some basic insights into the class of compounds that are in that plant and how much is there and everything. But with cannabis, we're getting very specific about very particular molecules rather than classes of compounds. Is that kind of what you mean?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's definitely super interesting seeing how many cannabis companies are building out fairly sophisticated facilities to accommodate their operations, and building out not just production laboratories but analytical laboratories. And even though third-party testing is required on the tail end for cannabis products and dietary supplements broadly, there's a lot more sophisticated and kind of intermediate testing that seems to be going on in the cannabis space. I've definitely seen that too.
So yeah, the lenses that we as manufacturers use and the lenses that consumers use to judge quality products tend to be reduced down to their potency levels.
Yeah, well, that's certainly a concern I've heard from dispensary owners. I'm interviewing a dispensary owner tomorrow. I plan on talking about this too, but the concept of THC shopping and CBD shopping, of the consumer focus just really being on what's that level of THC, what's that level of CBD, and that's how a lot of the purchasing is indexed. Like the value of the commodity itself is indexed off of, it's a very narrow point. It's a really, yeah. Well, 'cause what would be some quick advice you would have for either businesses that are trying to evaluate the quality of cannabis products, or consumers that are at stores that are buying cannabis products? Like, what's the incentive to think beyond THC, CBD, and that sort of kind of narrow focus on quality?
A really great question. Being that these parameters of measurement within cannabis products can also be heavily influenced by traditional capital marketing techniques, it's very hard to tell the difference between an authentic manufacturer who's putting in a lot of care and creative work into the products that they're manufacturing versus someone who is able to produce a high purity, high potency product with measurable results and a solid marketing profile to tell a story that might sound very appealing. From the consumer's perspective, I often advocate that try and identify a manufacturer whose philosophies of production match those of qualities that you believe in. As consumers, we vote with our dollars, and we can get information about a manufacturer purely based on potency, but we can also identify their environmental ethics of manufacturing and recognize those that are cognizant and caring of their supply chain, of where their ingredients come from, the production of the hemp plant material that's going into their products, and if there's quality and care in that area, that is most likely going to permeate into the production pathway of their products as well.
Well, yeah, let's talk about the supply chain a little bit. Based on what you just said, it seems like you have some concerns about how different pieces of the supply chain are handled. So let's go all the way to the front, and we can work our way towards the end. So let's start with the sourcing of ingredients. And so, for instance, in the hemp space, there are a lot of CBD products that most CBD products are either alcohol tinctures, MCT solutions, medium chain triglycerides, basically fractionated coconut oil solutions, or topicals, with some exceptions in there. For sure, there's nano emulsified CBD infused water, all these sort of things. But the most common things that we're seeing are basically tinctures, MCT solutions, and then topical rubs, topical sprays, and that sort of thing. So what concerns do you have about the beginning of that, sourcing those ingredients for those products, and how can producers do a better job of taking care of how they're making these products?
Within the world of medium chain triglyceride oil products, they have the ability to source from various sources, such as palm fruit kernel or coconut.
It's not all coconut oil.
It's not all coconut oil. So some manufacturers can obtain a reduction in cost through sourcing a 40-60 blend of MCT derived from both coconut and palm kernel oil. The impact of cultivation of palm is greater in some areas that have less regulation for agricultural practices, and require greater importation and transportation requirements.
More energy inputs to get it. And I know it has, in certain areas, pretty devastating impacts on local biodiversity where the palm is grown. I know it affects orangutan populations where there are orangutan populations. I remember that, studying that at one point, being a big issue. So that's a really good point, that MCT oil is not synonymous with coconut oil, which is something that may not be so obvious to a lot of people, because fractionated coconut oil and MCT oil are a lot of times used interchangeably. That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
And do you think producers are, like, if a consumer asked a producer their source of MCT oil, do you think they would be willing to share that information? Or would, if they don't, maybe that would be a sign that something is awry?
Yeah, precisely. In some business models, transparency is the key to consumer confidence. And in other business models, concealing information and substituting that with marketing phrases are more commonplace.
Yeah.
And the ability for a consumer to identify and, procure from manufacturers who are putting forth quality information, not just sound bites that are favorable superficially,
Yeah.
is a really important consumer consciousness layer that is not exclusive to the cannabis industry.
Right.
That permeates into all of our food choices, all of our lifestyle products that we engage in. But yeah,
Yeah. Well, what about, are there any issues people should be aware of with the alcohol-based products, the tinctures or alcohol-based sprays? Are there any issues with different sources of alcohol, concentrations, anything like that people should be aware of that are trying those products rather than the MCT-based oral products?
Yeah, the perspective I've typically taken around alcohol, ethanol-based tinctures, is that for them to retain lipophilic constituents, need to be above 75% ethanol by volume typically. That's kind of a blanket statement. Does not apply to all lipophilic constituents that we might find in herbs, but to retain their stability in the product, they do need to maintain a high alcohol content, which can be relatively difficult to consume and can lead to a reduction in compliance. But from the supply chain aspect, we have the ability to source ethanol from fermentation of sugarcane, fermentation of corn, fermentation of wheat, and fermentation of grape. And all of those have different supply chain impacts. Corn and wheat tending to be a little bit they tend to have a larger monoculture application that does impact. It does have impacts from
that style of agriculture.
Yeah, nutrition management, pest management, and then the whole burden of most corn being produced from genetically modified varieties. And so to reduce the demand for those by not sourcing from those commodities is favorable. Sugarcane is also one that can be very green, but leads to the potential of monoculture as well. And so there is no superior system, but I would recommend seeking ethanol that has organic certification and a non-GMO validation for the varieties that are cultivated.
Yeah, that's a really good point you bring up. And you said earlier, you vote with your dollar. It can be so easy to lose sight of what behaviors we're supporting by buying different products. It's something that slips my mind a lot, like thinking about stuff like that, like where's the alcohol actually coming from? And, by supporting a certain production style, you're supporting different types of agriculture that have pretty severe impacts on all sorts of things: human health, ecology, soil health in the areas where the agriculture is happening. We're talking about the manufacture of these products, the different consequences of choosing different ingredients. Let's shift to packaging for a moment. Something that you and I have talked about on the side before are issues related to chemical compatibility with how different products are stored, particularly like with tinctures or in MCT solutions. You have rubber dropper tops, different materials that could be used as seals and different things in caps that are coming into contact with materials that may not necessarily be compatible with the materials that are held inside the packaging. And this is an issue, once again, that isn't just with cannabis. It shows up in all sorts of applications: dietary supplement, manufacturing, food packaging, but there may be a little less awareness from my perspective in the cannabis space. Is that something you can comment on?
Yes, that is chemical compatibility is an ongoing issue I see within conventional THC and hemp processing environments. A lot of manufacturers are utilizing equipment that has not been thoroughly validated and tested, and can, in some circumstances, be utilizing solvents that might be denatured with other components in order to reduce costs in manufacturing. So one of the big areas that we see is ethanol manufacturers using things like heptane denatured alcohol, and how that has a actual impact on some of the fluid transfer equipment used in the manufacturing process. Terpenes are one of the great chemical classes produced by the cannabis plant. We, in the natural products world, would refer to that whole mixture as just essential oils that can be derived from steam distillation, subcritical CO2 extraction, some very cold hydrocarbon extraction, such as propane-based extracts yield a very terpene-rich product that, unless handled with the appropriate chemically compatible material, can cause considerable leaching that will bleed into the products without any test methods in place to identify those. Other than the organoleptic, rubbery, or acrid smell that might come from some silicone products that are used for either in the world of butane propane extraction. The purging steps are an area where chemical compatibility can become a very considerable issue, but the essential oil market, some of these products can have as much as 7 to 10% essential oil by mass without ever being packaged in a method that takes into consideration the assault that might have on, say, a silicone gasket for a jar lid.
Yeah.
And starting to encourage consumers to have compatibility conversations with their preferred manufacturer, I think, is a really good way to bring that topic up in a non-confrontational way, but at least provide the questions to the manufacturer to enable them an opportunity to express how they're addressing compatibility within their production system. And those manufacturers that cannot provide forthcoming information on their compatibility strategies would be a red flag as a consumer choice.
Yeah, that's a extremely good point. I mean, terpenes are solvents. I mean, a lot of things are solvents, but terpenes are actually fairly strong solvents for a lot of things, and they're used sometimes industrially as solvent. And so that's an extremely good point to bring up for producers to consider, is that terpenes can leach things out, break things down, and sometimes in pretty profound ways. I know that I've definitely tasted that sort of rubber taste you're referring to in some products, and wondered why that was, and whether that was a breakdown product of the packaging, or terpenes themselves too. When they break down, they can form these isoprene chains and form basically rubber. And so I've wondered if that particularly was an issue or not. Let's, in the context of hemp and the time that we have here, let's talk about a concept that I'm really interested to get your feedback on, given how close you are to the topic. To actually spin this out into two things. One is, I want to know your thoughts on the concept of full spectrum extracts. And then from there, I want to talk about the concept of THC-free extracts. And really, where I'm coming from with this is wanting to get into a broader conversation about the energy that it takes to manipulate extracts, to get them to a commercially viable state, as well as some of the marketing that's going on around about all these different types of extracts. And I know you've worked with basically all types of extracts that you could really think of when it comes to botanical extraction. So really, really interested to hear your thoughts on that. So let's start talking about full spectrum, and we'll go from there. When you hear the term full spectrum, I'll just put it really simply. What comes to mind when you hear that term in the context of the cannabis industry?
When I think of full spectrum, I am unfortunately jaded in the sense that it has been taken advantage of by commercial marketing techniques to really articulate product advantages over isolated products. Full spectrum is a very idealistic approach that herbalists have been invoking for a very long time, trying to get the most out of a botanical, but specifically isolating, that's the wrong word. Herbalists have been doing this for a very long time, trying to get the most therapeutic profile out of a plant, which has to do with multiple parts of the plant, and then multiple preparations of those different parts of the plant. And within the cannabis and hemp space, the primary processing is done on aerial parts, leaves, some stems, mostly flowers, very infrequently, but sometimes seed will get its way into some of the extracts, and those lead to end concentrates that have a greater chemical diversity. But in the full spectrum conversation, it's very important to identify what spectrum it is that we're referring to.
Yeah, great point, yeah.
Because within a spectrum, that can be on the platform of, say, the whole plant. And we know the cannabis plant has therapeutic properties within the roots, primarily sterol constituents, like the...
like campesterol, beta cytisterol, I think is one of them, yeah.
The stilbenoids are a powerful class that is outside of the spectrum of full spectrum oil.
Right.
Because we eliminate root tissue in most modern extraction techniques. So when we talk about full spectrum, it can often refer to either a cannabinoid spectrum, a terpene spectrum, or various degrees of pigments within a concentrate. Most people would agree that a distillate is not a full spectrum, though some people market distillate as a full spectrum cannabinoid profile, being that they are not isolating out any of the individual cannabinoids from that total cannabinoid process.
Right, so the perspective in calling distillate full spectrum is just focusing on the word spectrum, referring to cannabinoids only, and saying, like, well, we've retained the basic diversity of these cannabinoids that were present in the resins of the plant, which, I mean, let me ask you this straightforward question. Is it even possible to verify that right now? I mean, considering that there are well over 100 cannabinoids that the plant makes, almost certainly more and more isomers of well-known cannabinoids being found all the time. So is it even possible to say that even the full spectrum of cannabinoids has been maintained in a product like a distillate? Um, I don't know of any labs that test for all of those.
Correct. And that's where I think it's best to qualify it through the production methodology
Mm-hmm.
and how various techniques can capture more or less constituents from a mixture of plant material. In the world of herbal processing, there is the approach of tincturing.
Mm-hmm.
Tincturing can fractionate constituents based off the alcohol conditions.
Mm.
But then there are methods such as solid extracts and decocts that do a full extract with the solvents present, evaporating the totality of that solvent, which is capturing as much of the soluble or insoluble constituents from that plant at that point in time. And that has been the basis of herbal medicine for a very, very long time.
So like what a lot of people think of as RSO, which you and I have discussed, that like the term RSO really needs to kind of be left behind, because what Rick Simpson was recommending in making these types of extracts, he was recommending solvents like naphtha, acetone, all sorts of other kind of gnarly solvents. But these days, when people are referring to RSO, usually they're referring to ethanol-based extracts that have had the ethanol purged out. And with an attempt to capture as much phytochemical diversity as possible in a relatively low energy process compared to the refinement that happens afterwards. And so, because you come from a broader herbalism background, herbal science background, is there a definition of the term full spectrum that that herbalists would think of, or is the term really more kind of owned by the cannabis industry itself right now? Because I know whole plant extract, I'm familiar with that term from herbalism, with, like you said, being implied that you're using roots, aerial parts, the whole plant. But
multiple solvent classes to obtain the various polarities of constituents within that.
right, so yeah, if you want to do a whole plant extract, you've got to do multiple types of extractions, mix the extracts together to get that full blend, which maybe some cannabis extractors are doing, but I haven't seen many that are thinking on that level yet of trying to capture anything that's not like lipophilic. Basically, they seem to really primarily be focused on the resins, which goes back to what you were saying earlier of the focus on these few molecules in the plant and basing the quality of product on indexing it on just cannabinoids and not assigning value to other things is a really good point. And what about, like, some products are labeled full spectrum, and we talked about how with distillates, obviously that's an issue, and every company is using the term full spectrum differently. And then some companies are using the term broad spectrum, which in my mind is more honest, but equally as confusing. And is there any consistency there that you've seen? Because what I usually ask people is, well, how broad does the spectrum have to be considered broad? And once again, with distillate as an example, is distillate broad spectrum? Or even isolate that's like 95% pure and there's 5% other stuff in there. Is that broad spectrum? What are your thoughts on that? And then I think from here we can lead into talking about the THC-free stuff.
Yeah. I think broad spectrum really came out as people were stepping down from the full spectrum pedestal that they were trying to prop themselves up on.
Yeah.
After being pressed on details involving the diversity of chemistry within a product. Broad spectrum can often refer to a product like CO2 oil that has a greater diversity of constituents beyond the cannabinoids.
Mm-hmm.
These would go into the classes of low molecular weight terpenes, flavonoids, and in some circumstances, alkaloids that might be present
Mm-hmm.
in some of the aerial tissue. fatty acids that would be derived from the seeds themselves.
Yeah.
Those would all qualify as broad spectrum, but the ambiguity in that without adequate qualification, I think is still more of a marketing term than one that truly informs consumers about the composition of a product. And we are in this unique phase where we're beginning to actually quantify some of the compounds beyond cannabinoids, though infrequent in market, really allowing consumers to understand extraction methods and the associated refinement techniques will inevitably generate product classes that have known composition. And hopefully those production methods will give the consumers more insight into the diversity of chemistry they might find in that product than these labels that we might want to provide for the sake of simplification.
Right.
So a whole spectrum or a full spectrum cannabis product should include not just cannabinoids, not just terpenes, but all of the associated flavonoids, some sterol and fatty acids from other components of the plant, and then a diversity of tissue that are processed in multiple ways to get that full plant extract. And then the broad spectrum would be, I think, what most people are referring to as adding terpenes to distillate. And now that's a broader spectrum product.
Yeah. Or I've noticed a lot of products that are decarboxylated, and so the acidic forms of cannabinoids are removed. Those are a lot of times are considered broad spectrum. Or when THC is removed, a lot of those products I see referred to as broad spectrum, with the idea that the spectrum has been manipulated because THC has been removed, but there's still a diversity of phytochemistry there. And so in the little bit of time that we have left here, can you describe to listeners the basic process of removing THC from extracts? And maybe this can lead into talking about extract refinement broadly, but what does it take to do that, and what concerns do you have about it, and what sort of opportunities do you see related there? Because especially with the CBD market booming, it seems like that's going to the demand for THC-free products is going to continue for some time.
Certainly. There are three primary methods that are being employed by manufacturers for the remediation of THC. The first and foremost is column chromatography and flash chromatography, to separate out THC from the other cannabinoids through retention time. Another method that I'm interacting with very intimately right now is rotary partition chromatography, that is very similar to column chromatography but utilizes two immiscible liquids as a mobile and stationary phase as opposed to a solid stationary phase, so we can get some unique separation options through running bidirectionally.
Interesting.
And that gives us a little bit greater control of what constituents we'd like to incorporate, and gives us also more control of how many parts of the pie we take apart, versus which ones we want to keep together. So there is some superior applications to rotary partition chromatography for the isolation and removal of THC from a broader matrix of cannabinoids. And then finally, a couple techniques that are being utilized are dilution, taking an enriched CBD product and adding CBD distillate to that or CBD isolate to that product in order to, through mass, dilute out the THC level to a point that can be below LOQ while retaining some of the minor cannabinoids such as cannabigerol and cannabichromene to provide a certificate of analysis that would demonstrate a profile of cannabinoids beyond isolate.
Right, you're pushing that THC level below what an analytical lab can confidently report. And so there's still THC there, but by concentration, it's just driven down so low that you can get a certificate of analysis that makes it seem like there's no THC in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually a concept that I'm going to elaborate on in another recording, but just talking about lab testing, the concept of an LOQ, and that all analytical labs basically have this floor of a concentration that anything above that they can confidently report, but anything below they can't. Not with scientific integrity, and labs don't ever report that something is not present. They just say it's either not detected or it's below LOQ. So that's really important for people to understand that just because a lab test says that something's below LOQ, it does not mean that whatever that is that was tested is not present in that product in some ultra trace concentration. Sorry, continue. That's an important caveat.
Yeah, and one of the last techniques that I find very interesting, also slightly concerning, are the methods of what we consider THC is the chemical delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol.
Right.
And that is what is the primary marker for potency.
Mm-hmm.
And some manufacturers are generating various isomers or oxidized products that will reduce the total concentration in a product of its delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol while converting that to other forms that may still be bioactive, have a different therapeutic index, but will not be delta-9 THC.
Right. So technically, they will satisfy basic legal requirements to not have THC in them. However, they just have different forms of THC in them that are not considered by current regulations.
So one great example is the induction of oxidation to tetrahydrocannabinol to generate cannabinol, CBN. CBN is a very, very sedative and potent cannabinoid that will result in a very different pharmacological experience compared to a THC-free product without CBN.
Wow.
So even though both might be on the market as THC-free,
right,
one derived through induction of CBN will be marketably pharmacologically different than one that has had the THC removed via chromatography techniques.
Man, that is a really good point to make to our listeners, that even these THC-free products, man, they're not the same across the board. Yeah, and that's concerning. I've heard reports from my home state of Mississippi that like students in high school and stuff are actually getting savvy to this issue and finding CBD products on the market that have like Delta 8 THC or CBN, and they've figured out that they can still get a high from these products even though they technically do not have Delta 9 THC in them. And that's been a little concerning, and something I've mentioned before on a different podcast is that I view that as something that sooner or later will get the attention of the FDA as a public health and safety issue. That THC is, right now so narrowly defined that there's still room to make these products that are reaching kids that can have some adverse effects and intoxicating effects and that sort of thing. Well, I know we're short on time. I super appreciate you being able to take this little bit of time and drag me out into the wilderness. With having a baby these days, I don't always get to get out that frequently, so it's really nice to wake up early and sit out next to the river like this and hear the birds and talk about chemistry and herbal science. It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to making this a regular thing. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Jason.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for listening. Like I said, this will be a multi-part series, so check back soon, and at some point I'll try to compile all of the parts into one interview. If you want to learn more about the podcast, go to cacpodcast.com, or you can find Curious About Cannabis on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. And you can also check out our YouTube channel, where we post videos and audiograms of clips from some of these interviews, as well as some unique educational content about cannabis. And as always, if you want to support the podcast or any of the work that we're doing here through Natural Learning Enterprises, there's a variety of science education programs that we're working on. Feel free to become a member on Patreon at patreon.com/Natural Learning Enterprises. And you can support our work, get access to exclusive members-only content, get access to early releases of content, including some of these full interviews. So thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you later. Thanks, and take it easy. Bye.